So why don't we get to the topic directly, but first I have to give you the opening joke. So the opening joke is not such a long one. I did get one good comment. Someone told me on some of the sites that these videos are located on that I should warn people before I tell a joke so they can make sure that they're not eating or drinking, which I thought was very funny. That's much better than a lot of the nasty anti-Semitic rants that I get on some of the videos. So anyways, joke goes like this. Tonight we're going to be talking about a person whose erudition was matched only by his impecunity. That's a really good word. By his lack of financial resources. And so the joke goes that there are two of these young men in former Russian Empire, and they're malamdim. They teach Torah, and they're, as the profession usually is, they're quite impoverished. And one of them says to the other, you know what? If I had Rothschild's money, I would be richer than Rothschild. And the other guy says to him, really? How would you be richer than Rothschild? He says, because I would give bar mitzvah lessons on the side. Okay. So tonight's lecture is on Abraham Ibn Ezra, one of the most famous biblical commentators. His commentary is included in every standard edition of the Mikraot Gedolot, which is kind of like the standard compilation of the most important commentaries. It's been published for about 150 years now. But he is surprisingly one of the more controversial commentators. And I think he is widely studied by cognoscenti, but people who really get into some of the things he says that you would see that really he is quite challenging and quite atypical for many of the medieval commentators, as we shall see. So tonight's lecture is brought to us by a generous sponsorship by Eliezer and Greta Hermes. We're very grateful for sponsorships. They help offset the costs of having Mr. Balcony and Mr. Rodriguez do the filming and serve the rugelach, and it covers the cost of the rugelach as well. Very expensive rugelach. And of course, the remainder of the proceeds go to the upkeep of Young Israel, which is very kind to host us. So let's thank very much our sponsors for this week. And of course, your presence here is sufficient sponsorship for me. I feel very gratified that you've come and decided to participate with all of us. So, looking at Abraham and Ezra, his dates, as you can see, 1089 to 1164. He spent his life at the very end, the closing decades of the so-called Spanish Golden Era. And he was an autodidact of high proportions, and he claimed his fame primarily, as we mentioned, in biblical exegesis, but he was also a very, very profound grammarian at a time when Hebrew grammar was, in its most advanced stage in the medieval period. He was a philosopher, primarily following the Neoplatonic philosophy as expressed in the Jewish context, an astronomer, but we're going to concentrate in particular on his poetry. And I think one of the most interesting things about Ibn Ezra as a sort of Jewish type is that he made his living with his wits, but his personality was somewhat polemical in nature. He had kind of a dark side to his personality. He enjoyed black humor very much. And as a result, he made a fairly tenuous living while he was still living in Spain. Spain was an era, as we shall see in the next slide, that valued poetry as a career option, but when he was exiled from Spain, his fortunes took a dramatic turn for the worse, and he had to find other ways of making a living. And we'll see how it impacted his thought and his process. But let me show you one of his most famous poems translated to English. It's called My Stars. This is a translation by, hang on, I've got it here, by Robert Measy. And the poem goes, and he's lamenting his fate and how it's difficult to be so impecunious. He says, on the day I was born, the unalterable stars altered. If I decided to sell lamps, it wouldn't get dark till the day I died. Some stars, whatever I do, I'm a failure before I begin. If I suddenly decided to sell shrouds, people would suddenly stop dying. Right? If I decided to stop selling the burial clothing, then people would give up dying. That's what he's writing. And he's in these kinds of poems, you hear his kind of bitter attitude towards his poverty, but tempered by his own good humor and wit. I'm going to read you one more poem that also expresses this. This is also translated by Robert Measy, and it's entitled, I Have a Garment. So he writes, I have a garment which is like a sieve, through which girls sift barley and wheat. In the dead of night I spread it out like a tent, and 1,000 stars pierce it with their gleams. Sitting inside I see the moon and the Pleiades, and I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, Pleiades? 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 You play a D's, I play a Do's. And on a good night, the great Orion himself. I get awfully tired of counting all the holes, which seem to me like the teeth of many saws. A piece of thread to sew up all the other threads would be, to say the least, superfluous. If a fly landed on it with all his weight, the little idiot would hang by his foot cursing. Dear God, do what you can to mend it. Make me a mantle of praise from these poor rags. Right, so he's talking about how he's so poor that his clothes are literally falling apart. It's like a sieve. You can see through it to the stars and so on. You get a sense of his personality from his poetry. Now, let's put him in his historical context. So his primary activity can really be divided into two phases. He lived in Spain up until the year 1140, at which point, for reasons that are unclear, he was exiled from the Iberian Peninsula and had to endure a state of wandering for the next 20-odd years of his life till he finally passed away. So there's two different stages in his life. The first stage was when he was a poet for hire in Spain. And if you recall, several years ago we looked at Shmuel ibn Nagrela, and a few other, Yehuda Halevi, with whom, by the way, Ibn Ezra was very well associated. The Spanish Golden Era was a place in time where poetry was highly valued, where poetry as an expression of the essence of the soul was considered popular entertainment, in which everybody was an amateur poet. Warriors, soldiers, merchants, everyone tried their hand at poetry, and it was a way of kind of expressing yourself to demonstrate your wit and your erudition and your sensitivity. It was just one of those things that was very, very popular in that society. Just by way of modern contrast, I'm always, when I talk about the Spanish Golden Era and the poetry, it reminds me of back in the late 80s when I first went to the Soviet Union when I was doing my dissertation research. And it was in the period of Gorbachev, and things were lightening up, things were a lot easier, but there was still quite a bit of restriction on society. So I was always impressed. You'd walk down the main streets like Khreshchatyk and Kiev and places like that, and you would see set up on the streets individual merchants with long tables of books, paperback books, primarily in Russian, quite often translated into Russian from other languages, and they were like classics. Don Quixote and Shakespeare and all these tremendous books. And if you walk down the streets, you think, wow, what an incredibly literate society. Everybody wants to read all these 19th century greats, Pushkin, Turgenev, Shalom Aleichem, very popular. And it was really impressive. So, that society really valued poetry, literature, and so on. That's what they had for sale. Then I went back 2 years later, 1991, right during the time when it was collapsing, and the controls were all gone. And when you'd walk down the big streets, you would see the people were still there with their book sales and their stands and things like that. But you know what they were selling?
Fire. Paper fire?
No, not paper fire, although you could use the money for that at that time. They were selling detective novels and pornography. Those were the two big hits. Pushkin, forget about it. Tolstoy, where is he? It's all Playboy, and things like that, all in the streets. Because you can see that, the love of literature was clearly state-supported, right? So it shifted, or maybe it just revealed what was really there to begin with. The market determined what people would read. Looking at Spain, though, Spain definitely was a highly literate, highly cultured society, and the Jews were especially prominent, primarily because Spain was very unusual. It was a triangular culture. Unlike North Africa and the Middle East, where Jews were primarily the single minority in a Muslim sea, so they were the only religious minority of any size, and unlike Christian Europe, from, let's say, north of the Pyrenees, England, France, and so on, towards the east. It was a Christian world, and Jews were the only sizable minority there. Spain was this unusual place which had three cultures interacting: the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews. And the Jews constituted not quite a plurality, but a very large portion of the population, and they were kind of like the connective tissue between the Christians and the Muslims. They were the culture brokers that were able to, cross those cultural boundaries and communicate the values of either culture to the other. And so Jews really excelled during this time period, and some of Spain's greatest poets from the Golden Age were in fact Jewish in origin. This, by the way, is a picture of the Lion's Court in the Alhambra castle. I believe it's in Cordoba. And Seville? Seville, thank you. According to some historians, this may have been built for a Jewish prince. Well, it's still a matter of some dispute, but nevertheless, the fact that even we would talk about its possibility indicates the heights that Jews reached at that time. Now, in Ibn Ezra's case in particular, he was what we would call in the Yiddish terminology a Luftmensch. Is anyone familiar with that term, Luftmensch? How would you translate Luftmensch? He lived off the air, right. So Luft means like air or wind, and Mensch, of course, is a person. So the Luftmenschen, it has kind of like a double meaning. On the one hand, it means someone who's like very ethereal and intellectual and, usually rabbinic in nature. But on the other hand, it also means that he has no visible means of support. I still know people like this today, people who are brilliant, and they're scholars and they know so much, and yet you wonder, how do they put food on the table? Where does it come from? Somehow it comes from somewhere. So that's a Yiddish term, more appropriate for the 19th century in Russia, but it definitely applies to an entire, trope of Jewish history, and we see it with Ibn Ezra. In Spain, he was primarily paid for, his life was paid for by patrons, people who were extremely wealthy, who would commission him to write family poems. Sometimes write, I've forgotten, there's a special term for them, like bragging poems that describe their exploits. Sometimes they would hire him to write insult poems in which they would decry their enemies. And we have, and of course, romantic poetry in Arabic primarily, Judeo-Arabic as well, very, very popular. And, he made a living out of it. It's also, though, somewhat of a tenuous living. Here's one of his poems here where he writes about the patron, because of course he's completely dependent upon the whim of the wealthy patron who is going to hire him to write his words. Once he writes the poem, then it's all over. He has to go on to another patron. So he writes, "When I come to the patron's house early in the morning, they say, he has already ridden away. When I come in the evening, they say, he has already gone to sleep. He either climbs into his carriage or climbs into bed. Woe to the poor man born to misfortune," which here he describes the kind of very happenstance and ephemeral quality of his revenue stream, which was quite problematic for him. So he was highly educated, tremendous command of the Hebrew and the Arabic languages, and of course the Judeo-Arabic, which is kind of like the Spanish equivalent of Yiddish, which is kind of like, Yiddish has been termed by Billy Crystal as German with phlegm. That's a joke, German with phlegm. Well, I'll say it. Oh, I forget. I always like that. Maybe it's because I'm speaking.
Ladino?
Ladino is a different language, Spanish Jewish. This is Judeo-Arabic.
Ladino is mostly Spanish
and
Turkish.
The Jews are, historically, we're tremendous borrowers when it comes to language. We'll constantly take phrases, syntax, grammatical forms from other languages and incorporate them into our daily speech. Quite often, many of these languages, because they were created in environments where the non-Jews were illiterate, the alphabets used to write them were Hebrew. The Jews took their Hebrew alphabet and applied it to the way they spoke medieval German or Spanish and so on. I have a great dictionary at home. It's like a 1907 American Yiddish dictionary that has such classic Yiddish words as sonovagon, right? Things like that. So I'm constantly borrowing these sorts of terms. And anyways, he was not, sometimes you see in the biographies, he was a physician. That's not at all the case. He was a poet. first and foremost. But his personality was such that, as we can see from the poems that I've read to you already, he wasn't really set out for the communal rabbinate. He wasn't the kind of person who, would listen to other people's problems, not the kind of person who could give public sermons, not the kind of person that you would go to cry your heart out to, those kinds of things that you might expect of a communal rabbi. And as we shall see, his approach to the traditional biblical text was highly unique, and so he was not necessarily well suited for a career as a dayan, as a judge. So that's why he was left entirely as a professional poet. So this is basically how he lived most of his life, and then at the age of 50, for reasons which are, as I mentioned, unclear, he was forced to leave Spain. I'll give you one of the predominant theories in a moment, but I will note the next slide. The next slide is right. One of his closest associates, far more successful in this right, was the great Yehuda Halevi, the author of the Kuzari, a very important medieval philosophical work that it's really a triangular debate between Christians, Jews, and Muslims, stated in the kind of parable of the story of the conversion of the Khazar kingdom. He actually married his son Isaac to Yehuda Halevi. We know very little about his personal life, but we do know that he was married into Yehuda Halevi's father through his son Isaac. We also know, sadly, that Isaac later traveled to Babylon and converted to Islam there, for reasons which are not clear. We do have some elegies for his son's passing, which some historians have opined refer to Ibn Ezra as sitting Shiva for his son leaving the faith, but the chronological details of those particular elegies do not fit with what we know about Isaac's life, so it's unlikely that they're actually referring to him. They may have referred to another family member. At any rate, to try and understand why he left, it may be that it was the result of the persecution of the Almohads. The Almohads were Muslims who took an unusually strict approach to Islamic theology and to Muslim practice, and they were far less pragmatic when it came to how to deal with their Jewish minority, and certainly with their Christian minority. To back up just a little bit, the Muslims had determined already in the 8th century a modus vivendi with the Jews through a document which was called the Pact of Umar. According to this pact, which was directed to the Caliph of the era, Umar, the Jews asked him for a statement of exactly what are their rights and privileges within the Muslim world, because the Muslim world was expanding dramatically at the time. They were threatening some states with war if they would not convert to Islam. They were also expanding over many regions where Muslims were, where there were still major populations such as Zoroastrians and Christians and so on. What were they doing with them? So the Jews, according to the story, the Jews asked for a clear statement of what's our position in Muslim society. And Umar responded, at least as the document says, that Jews are allowed to live within Muslim lands as long as they do not basically expand their religion. So, for example, the Pact of Umar forbids the Jews from building new synagogues. It forbids them from renovating their synagogues. They're allowed to keep them in repair, but they're not allowed to build additions. They're not allowed to carry weapons, ride horses, be very loud in their public celebrations. They're not allowed to do all kinds of things which are largely symbolic in nature, meaning that as long as you keep to yourselves and you don't impinge on Muslim sensibilities, then you are allowed to live in our society. In some cases, Jews reacted to this by building their synagogues underground. So you see, some Syrian synagogues are massively huge underground, but on the above ground level, they look basically like regular buildings. But mostly, Jews dealt with the Pact of Umar through bribing local officials. The enforcement of the Pact of Umar was very lax, and it was very, very common for Jews to simply, make an arrangement with local officials, and most of those symbolic restrictions were simply lifted. That changed, however, from time to time in Muslim history, and one of those times was when the Almohads took over southern Spain and North Africa, as you can see in this map here. And they suddenly insisted on a much more doctrinaire interpretation of the Pact of Umar, so much so that Jews found it very uncomfortable to live under their rule. Several important Jews, including Maimonides' family, for example, fled from southern Spain and North Africa at this time. Maimonides would make his way all the way across North Africa into Tunisia and then down eventually into Egypt, were simply fleeing that kind of religious persecution. So it's quite reasonable to assume that the reason Ibn Ezra left Spain was because he was too Jewish for that society. Okay, I think I should pause for a couple of questions. Yes, please.
I was just wondering, is there any evidence of what language he wrote in?
Oh yes, definitely. He wrote primarily in Judeo-Arabic and in Hebrew, but as we shall see later, mainly his Hebrew writings survive. That's primarily because the Judeo-Arabic was lost in a massive sea of similar documents. People were constantly writing poetry. It's like people writing memoirs today. There's so many memoirs and they just get lost. But the Hebrew materials, especially in Christian Europe, were especially valued by the Jewish communities there, and they have been much better preserved. Judith.
Was he a contemporary of Maimonides?
Maimonides was born, I believe, in 1143 and died in 1204. So they overlapped, but Maimonides would have been very young when Ibn Ezra was already, a middle-aged man.
So, in terms of Rashi, where are we in the...
Yeah, we're all in the same era. Rashi died, I think, about 1102, more or less. He's right after the First Crusades, and that's about 60 years before Ibn Ezra was born. So these are 200 years of really tremendous creativity of Jews, not only in Spain, but in the case of Rashi, in the Rhineland and in southern France.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Abramson, when you're talking about you weren't sure why he converted, it reminded me when I was a teenager, my grandfather got sick and he was in Montefiore Hospital in Bronx, and he said to my father, he says, he wants to convert to become a Christian.
Uh-huh.
I said, what are you talking about? I said, why would you want to do that? And he says, better a Christian to die than a Jew.
Okay, I probably will take that one out of the internet version of the lecture, just because I have like a lot of Latvians who are probably Christians who watch these videos. But okay. All right, so let's go further before we descend any further. Okay, so his era of wandering, as I mentioned, from about the year 1140 till his death in the 1160s, he leaves southern Spain, he goes to Italy, he makes his way to Provence, which is like southern France. He goes across North Africa. He's in England for a while, including in Oxford, and he's traveling throughout these Christian regions, and suddenly he's like a fish out of water, because his tremendous skills as an Arabic poet and Judeo-Arabic poet are not so useful in these Yiddish-speaking regions where people have no idea what's going on with this. Let's recall, this is especially for the Latvian audience who may not be familiar with these ethnic divisions. We have several major sub-ethnic groups in European Judaism. You have the so-called Jews from Spain called Sephardic. Sepharad, of course, is the Hebrew word for Spain. And their cultural orbit is primarily Arabic in nature. They're part of the Muslim world, and they value a lot of Muslim values, cultural values, and so on. But then north of the Pyrenees, all the way out to what would be Kievan Rus and later the Russian Empire, those are German-speaking Jews called Ashkenazi, from the word Ashkenaz, a biblical term which the Jews used to refer to the Rhineland, as we discussed last week. And these two sort of subgroups developed on very different tangents. They have, although they consider themselves one faith, They have different characteristics, racially. They tend to, Sephardic Jews tend to have darker skin, dark hair, and so on. Ashkenazi Jews quite often lighter skin, sometimes blonde, red hair, things like that. They are different linguistically, with the Ashkenazi Jews being overwhelmingly Yiddish-speaking from Germanic tongues, and the Sephardic Jews being Arabic-speaking. Later, other languages as well. And they have distinctions also in terms of their rituals. The Sephardic Jews, for example, have the unbridled pleasure of eating rice on Passover, and beans on Passover, whereas the Ashkenazi Jews unfortunately do not have that pleasure because they consider rice a little bit too much fun for Passover, and it's considered too much like bread, which is forbidden on the holiday. And so they've developed distinct ritual traditions as a result, and those major distinctions, which were already present in the 9th century, are maintained through the entire second millennium since the diaspora. So here he is, he's a Sephardic Jew with, he's just great in all of these Arabic cultural norms, but they just don't fly in the Rhineland or in southern France. Nobody understands this kind of poetry. It doesn't make sense, and it's not valued anymore. So he has to kind of shift his occupational talents more towards the rabbinical side, more towards the, well, yes, I know a lot of Torah as well, and because he's so linguistic in nature, he says, I know a phenomenal amount of Hebrew grammar, which at this time was just really being developed. There were a few great schools of Spanish Jews who were grammarians of this language before it had not been really, codified, with the exception of the Masoretes. And so he's really explaining to Jews in Christian lands what the biblical terms actually mean. And you have rabbis sitting around saying, oh my gosh, so that's what that word means. I've been reading it all my life, never quite sure what it meant. And Ibn Ezra is there to explain the grammatical structure of the Torah itself. He wrote many commentaries on the Bible, many other treatises of a secular nature as well, and unfortunately, due to his poverty, he often had to write them several times because he would sell his own originals in order to make enough money to live off of, and then he would have to recreate them from memory to sell them again. Even the writing materials that he would use, the vellum and the quills and things like that, were very expensive for him, and so it was often, he had no choice but to sell the last copy of some great book that he had written and then just hope that he could rewrite it. That's why in some copies of the Ibn Ezra's commentary in the Talmud, on the Torah, you have several versions, a short version and a long version. The short version was one of the earlier manuscripts that survived. The long version is one of his, revisions as he had to rewrite the text from memory. Very, very difficult time. This is, by the way, the traditional iconic representation of Maimonides, who was in that period. We don't have a similar kind of icon for Ibn Ezra. Please. Ladino develops a little later. It has a much more Spanish as its origin. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm not really an expert in this, it probably comes from the Jews in Spain after Reconquista, after the Christians come into the area and before the 15th century when they're expelled. But we borrow language, we borrow these things all the time and just call them our own. In fact, there's a language which some people call yeshivish. You may have heard it, based on the word yeshiva, like a rabbinical seminary. And they have dictionaries of yeshivish that are available now. I mean, you read them, they sound funny, but they really are taka, to say. They really are taka languages. People, they're koinas, they're kind of like pidgin languages that people will throw in words all the time. Mamish, right, Okay. So, what about his Torah commentary? This is what really makes him the most famous, the reason why Ibn Ezra has reached such fame. He called his commentary the Sefer HaYashar, the straightforward book, the correct, true, straight book. And basically it's because he took a very unique approach to the biblical text, which was quite challenging for many and remains quite challenging. First of all, he was a great rationalist. He believed very deeply that the Torah had to make sense, and he refused to succumb to mystical interpretations of the Bible. He was very, very skeptical of the midrashic interpretation of the Torah, and whenever possible, he would simply reject it as a meaning for the actual text. Let's just back up and understand what that means. So, in traditional Jewish thought, there are actually two Torahs. There's the written Torah, which corresponds to the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In Hebrew, Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Dvarim. And then there is an entirely different body of knowledge called the Oral Torah, which according to traditional Jewish theology was also given to Moses on Mount Sinai, which reminds me of a joke I'll tell you in a minute. And it was not recorded. It was passed down orally, student to teacher, rabbi to teacher, for many, many generations. And then it was ultimately set down in writing over the centuries. The kinds of books that are derived from oral Torah include the Mishnah and the Talmud in particular, the Kabbalistic teachings that later formed the Zohar, and most importantly for our purposes today, a really interesting body of knowledge called the Midrash. So Midrash is sort of like this poetic interpretation of the Torah, which adds meaning, sometimes, crafts whole storylines out of thin air that are not in the biblical text at all, but explains the story in often a radically different way. So let me give you an example of one of Ibn Ezra's approaches that will illustrate what the Midrash does and why Ibn Ezra doesn't like it. So a few weeks ago we read the famous depiction of Jacob's deceit of his father Isaac. Right? Rebekah overhears Isaac, who is now a blind man, saying to his elder son Esav, "Go out and make me a barbecue because I'm going to give you my blessing now." The firstborn son, things like that. Esav had earlier sold his firstborn privileges to Jacob for to use the classic phrase from King James, a mess of pottage. In Hebrew it's just lentil stew, but a mess of pottage. It sounds really good, right? And that's become proverbial in English. To sell something for a mess of pottage means to sell it incredibly low. Anyways, as the story goes, I'm sure you're familiar, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, says to Jacob, "Quick, put on these furs so you will feel like your twin brother Esav," evidently fraternal twins from the line of the story, "and go in to Isaac with this delicious meal that I've just prepared for him, and you get the blessing instead of your brother." Jacob goes in there, and this is the part where we have to get to. Isaac says to him, "Is that you?" And Jacob says, he says, "Ani Esav," I think it's Bechorecha, right? "Behold, it is I, Esav, your firstborn." And the Midrash says, the first thing you read, by the way, when you read that on face value, what would you say Jacob did? He lied. He lied. He says, "It's me, Esav, your firstborn." The Midrash says, no. It's not what he meant. He said, "It's me," in square brackets, Jacob. "Esav is your firstborn." Like two different sentences, right? And it's really slippery and sneaky and stuff like that. But the Midrash, by saying that, cleverly preserves Jacob as the paradigm of truth-telling, which is a whole different story beyond the class here. You have to speak to Rabbi Grunstein about that. But that's the Midrashic approach, which is exemplary of the oral Torah's, working with the text, technically correct but still implausible, that later informs the Jewish tradition. And of course it's recorded that way in Rashi's great commentary. And when you send your children to schools, chances are that's the way they will learn the story, with the Midrash actually built into the text. Quite often I have students who are 19, 20 years old, and they might look at the text for the first time they've looked at it seriously since they were 10, and they say, "Wait a second, where's all the business here that I learned in school?" And they were all midrashim that the children learned without discrimination as being part of the biblical text. So what does Ibn Ezra say? Ibn Ezra says, just reject all that. He says, no, that's very nice, very clever, but that's just homiletical. The truth is, according to Ibn Ezra, Jacob didn't tell the truth. He might have had a good reason not to tell the truth. There was, there's justifications for it, but don't try to tell me that the Midrash is actually depicting how that conversation went. Now, in this kind of approach, Ibn Ezra is swimming against the tide of the vast majority of medieval commentators. And if it were not for his kind of approach, you would have difficulty saying that in an Orthodox synagogue, because it would be a challenge to the Midrash, which is canonized as a holy text. But Ibn Ezra felt that no, my approach in the Sefer Yashar is going to be very, very rational. I'm only going to work with the words that are actually in the text, and I will try to stay very far away from Midrash to understand what exactly is the storyline. He worshipped the text. He believed that the biblical text was absolutely accurate in every detail, but he did not use the Midrash to explain away some of the more problematic aspects of it. So another example, he was a great traditionalist. He believed that it was rational to assume that God could perpetrate miracles. You know, if you believe that God runs the entire world and God is in control of the natural world, then certainly if God decides to suspend the natural law for some given purpose, like to split the Red Sea or something like that, the Sea of Reeds, then certainly he could do it. That makes sense. It's logically consistent. However, all of you who have participated in a Passover Seder will remember the passage in the Haggadah that talks about exactly how many miracles were performed at the sea, right? And the rabbis have a little debate. There was like 10, no, there was 50, no, there was 500, you know, and they go on, expanding the number of miracles. Ibn Ezra didn't like that. He would say, look, it says in the biblical text, the sea was split, that is a miracle that occurred, but don't talk to me about all these other thousands of miracles. He doesn't like, you know, them multiplying and multiplying. And some of them are quite bizarre. Like, for example, one last example, there's a reference in the Bible to Moses putting the curtains on top of the walls of the tabernacle. And the wall, so he's actually like, you know, they had these like hides that were put over the walls of this structure that they would build in the desert. And the tabernacle was, I think it was 10 amot high, which is close to 30 feet tall. And so then they said, therefore, if Moses did it, must mean that Moses was 30 feet tall. And okay, that it does say that he did it, but it doesn't say exactly how he did it. Ibn Ezra doesn't like those kinds of approaches at all. He says that's midrash, it's very nice, you can think about what it means on a philosophical level, but on a literal level he refused to accept it. Ironically, this relates him to the much later so-called higher criticism of the 19th century, the Wellhausen school and other schools of biblical critics, who argued that the Torah was not written by Moses directly or any one person. And that's like really shattering for an Orthodox theologian. Of course, the term Orthodox didn't exist then, but I'll give you a great example of Ibn Ezra's approach. The very last section of the book of Deuteronomy. Does anyone remember what happens there? Moses dies, right. And the text describes his death and his burial, and it's all there. So wait a second, we call it Toras Moshe, the Torah of Moses. Who wrote those lines? So the Midrashic approaches are multiple. The Midrashic approaches say he wrote them, Moses wrote them himself with tears in his eyes, describing his own mortality and things like that. Ibn Ezra has a much more straightforward approach, saying, no, Joshua wrote these words. It does not bother him to think that certain passages of the Torah may be interpolations from later editors. Which again, you won't find too many Orthodox rabbis talking about this, but it is Ibn Ezra's approach. There are also a few anachronisms in the Bible that say things like, and this is what we call it to this very day. This is what we call it to this very day. So what do you mean? We don't necessarily call it that to this very day today, but that sounds like a much later interpolation by another author who said, let's add in this verse here which sounds good. So that's theologically a very challenging statement, because if you start picking at the text of the Torah, it's like picking at a loose thread from a garment, right? If I'm going to pull this one out, you might end up without one sleeve. But that's nevertheless Ibn Ezra's approach, which I got to go back to the joke. That's why he had holes in his clothing. Actually, he had holes in his parchment in some ways. But brilliant analysis and definitely part of the canon. It shows you the flexibility of even medieval Jewish thought that Ibn Ezra could be included in the canon, even though his approach is quite radical. I have to tell you the joke. Did I tell you a joke about the kid and its mother's milk?
No.
Okay, I'm glad you don't remember. So it goes like this, because I was talking earlier about Moses and things like that. So in Jewish law, many of the laws of keeping kosher are derived from the fact that there's a particular law that's repeated 3 times. Thou shalt not boil the kid in its mother's milk. Right? You can't take a calf and take the milk from its mother and cook them together. That's where the prohibition of meat and milk come from. You're not allowed to eat meat and milk together. The rabbis also learn out from the fact that it's repeated 2 more times, and apparently redundantly, that you also learn that you can't sell meat and milk together, and you can't cook them even with no intention of eating them. So the joke goes like this. God is reciting the Torah to Moses for him to write it down, and God says, okay, here's the next line, Moses. Thou shalt not boil the kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, oh, I know what that means. That means that we can't have chicken parmesan, because certainly, chickens don't give milk, but since you're telling me this, then I know that not only beef and milk, also chicken and milk is forbidden. God says, Moses, all I said was, thou shalt not boil the kid in its mother's milk. Moses says, wait, I know what that means. That means we have to have 2 sets of dishes, and we have to wait 6 hours between them in order to... And God says, Moses, all I said was, thou shalt not boil the kid in its mother's milk. He says, oh, I know what that means. It means like glass, which does not absorb the same way that ceramic does. You can soak it in your bathtub for 72 hours, changing the water every day. And God says, Moses, have it your own way. Those are slightly Ibn Ezra-esque jokes that my grandmother, Allah Hashalom, used to tell. Okay, other examples, the Midrash says that Yoel, one of the authors of a book of the prophets, was the son of Samuel, and Ibn Ezra says there's internal literary evidence to discount that, so don't pay attention to the Midrash. But on the other hand, to give you a sense of his traditionalism, because the book of Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet in Hebrew, is specifically ascribed to Shlomo, King Solomon, Ibn Ezra says, absolutely, this is totally written by Solomon. Although 19th century biblical critics would say no, they would say it's written later, and so on. So on the one hand, he's very radical in his approach, and in other places, definitely very traditional. Okay, let's move on. And throughout all this, to emphasize his halachic approach, his traditionalist approach, he definitely was a completely by-the-book observant Jew. I mean, there was no indication whatsoever that his somewhat iconoclastic approach to biblical text in any way affected his observance of Jewish law. Even though much Jewish law is also based on Midrash, specifically halakhic Midrash, he was absolutely punctilious about all of his scrupulous observation of Jewish law. So his rationalism, he did not feel in any way conflicted with his appreciation of the text. It reminds me, just to share with you a little personal moment. So I was learning Talmud with my 13-year-old son Boaz, and we're looking at a particular passage, and the Talmud asks a question. Why are these 4 types of damages? The horn, the pit, the tooth, and the fire. Why are they mentioned in this order? Different kinds of damages and torts and things like that. And my son's approach was like, why is it asking this question? It says right there they're mentioned in this order. Why did you have to ask why? It's written right there. Like he's at an age where because it is written, that's all you need to know. Right? Someone put it down on paper. And so I said something to him which maybe I would take back if I would say it differently. I would say, no, you don't understand. When you study Talmud, in my humble opinion, you have to have the attitude of a heretic. You have to say, I question this, I doubt that, how do I know this is true? And you have to go into it with a very, very critical approach to the text. Just because it's written there, you can question everything that's written there. Nothing is off limits. And so we had a productive learning session. Yeah, okay, anyways, I'll probably edit that out. So, he was definitely a very, very big proponent of the Talmud as the constitution of Judaism and the entire halakhic tradition that went through it. And he stood firm against the criticism of the Karaites. The Karaites, you may recall from an earlier lecture we gave last year, there was a 9th century movement that broke away from mainstream Judaism, saying that the written Torah was accurate and authoritative, but the oral Torah, which I described earlier, including the Talmud, was simply an invention of the rabbis. And Karaites were actually quite a strong proportion of the Jewish population right up until about the 13th, 14th century. The Cairo Geniza documents indicate just how strong they were. And nevertheless, Ibn Ezra takes a very, very firm stance and says, no, they're totally wrong. Even though I have my questions about what the Midrash means and how to use the Midrash, in no way do I believe that the Talmud is an invention of the rabbis in the same sense that the Karaites do. So he defended the Talmud and traditionalist Judaism, but at the same time he was very, very skeptical of the more credulous approaches that would come from Midrashic or Kabbalistic sources. This was especially useful in 1263, and he had a very profound impact on the scholar Nachmanides, who was perhaps the greatest scholar ever to be called into a church-sponsored disputation. I have a whole lecture on this as well on the web. Oh my gosh, if you're curious about this, you can see a whole lecture on this. Who wants to hear me talk for an hour on the web? But the Nachmanides was an elder scholar in Spain, and the church ordered him to appear in a debate against a convert to Christianity named Pablo de Cristiani. De Cristiani brought forth a whole slew of complaints against Judaism, indicating that the Talmud in particular was blasphemous and was slandering Christianity, and that the Talmud was essentially what was keeping Jews from converting to Christianity. And so Nachmanides had to appear in this very, tense debate with this former Jew who was slandering Judaism, and he had to defend the Talmud and Judaism from those attacks. And the approach he used was very heavily dependent on Ibn Ezra, saying that the Midrash, in which a lot of these passages that were under criticism was contained, is purely a homiletical tool that can be understood in many different ways, almost like poetry. One does not have to accept the Midrash with the same level of authority as the Torah whatsoever. And he quite successfully defended the Talmud against Pablo de Cristiani's attacks. Of course, Nachmanides later ended up being exiled from Spain, and he ended up making his way to Israel. But nevertheless, the approach that Ibn Ezra used to the Torah and the Midrash was especially useful in 1263. Okay, so to bring it to a conclusion, thinking about who Ibn Ezra was, I'm just going to give you one more poem to think about. He was an exceptionally brilliant mind with a very acerbic style in his poetry that often reached very, very deep into the recesses of the human soul and expressed anguish and sorrow and longing. Actually, maybe I'll read to you two quick poems. Let me just express. I've read to you some of his sort of like self-deprecating poems, but let's listen for a second to one of his many, many religious poems. He writes this one entitled, "When I Hunger to Praise Thee," translated here by Meyer Waxman. And it's capital T, Thee, meaning God. "When I hunger to praise Thee, I'm sated. When to worship I thirst, I am drunk. Then my heart is secure when I fear Thee. When in terror and awe I am sunk. When I bow to Thee low I am lifted. When I fall in Thy presence I rise. I am free when I serve for Thy name's sake, my oppressors who Thy name despise. All suffering is sweet to my heart when I know that my God Thou art." Very powerful sentiment of the subjugation to God's will is in itself an uplifting experience. Rather, the servitude itself is an expression of religious freedom. Very powerful sense. You see that he's not all joking and complaining. He's very, very deep as a thinker and so on. His rationalist interpretation of the Torah, although in a traditionalist context, was very, very profound and had tremendous impact on later thinkers. Ironically, even though he himself is one of the canonized commentators, one of the greats published in the Mikra Gedolot, next to Rashi and Nachmanides and many others, nevertheless his approach to certain biblical verses as being, later human additions, place him in a different trajectory altogether with thinkers like Baruch Spinoza and later 19th century criticisms of the biblical text. His poetry, however, has lived in translation and in fact impressed many other later poets. Here is a famous poem by Robert Browning called Rabbi Ben Ezra. Ibn, of course, means son of in Arabic, so the Ben Ezra refers to it. Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be. The last of life for which the first was made, our times are in his hand. Who saith, a whole I planned, youth shows but half. Trust God, see all, nor be afraid. It goes on for many, many more stanzas. But that first line of grow old with me reached deep into English language sources. And for those of you who watch this on the web, I'll probably just play it now if you like. But even John Lennon recorded a version of a song based on Robert Browning's poem, which is in itself an interpretation of Ibn Ezra's work. So I'm going to play that afterwards because I can't put it on the web or I get hit by copyright infringements, but you'll get to see it anyways. With that, I will prematurely conclude and thank you for your attention as always, and I hope you have an excellent week. Remember, we will not meet next week. The week after we'll return. Okay. Thank you.